Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of our scale modeling channel. You might be asking yourself, how come there's no scale models? Why is Mike not talking about scale models? Well, I've got pretty diverse interests, and one of them is model railroading. So what I'm going to do this evening is I'm going to show you how I built my workbench. It's a pretty unconventional approach. I use 2x4s because I need to walk on this in case I need to get to the HVAC, the electrical work, or the plumbing. The other thing I did was I left about 16 inches of walk-around space all the way around here, all the way back. We're about 26.5 feet long. It came out pretty good, and it's going to be pretty big when it's done. The other thing I did was I integrated some shelving for all of my scale modeling stash under here, especially the ones I hide from my wife that I buy that I don't want her to know about just yet. So what we're going to do, again, is I'm going to show you step by step how I built the bench work, and I'm going to show you some really cool, innovative things that I incorporated into this bench work. So let me show you. So here is the first innovation. On most bench work, most guys, what they do is they just build a tray on the side of it. What I decided to do was have a rollout control tray, and it really came out good. So it saves a little bit of space, and it's innovative. And what we're going to do is we're going to put trim work over the top, and then there'll be curtains all the way around here to hide the shelving and all the stash. And there'll just be pull-off curtains here. You just part them and pull the tray out. There'll be a brass handle here, and away you go with the trains. So let me show you the other one. I wanted to show you the display case. Actually, Tiberius wanted to show you the display case. He wanted to be in some of the videos, so here he is, and he's had dinner, and he's got a full belly, and he's acting kind of lazy. Anyway, so I integrated this display case for my large scale model aircraft. It's going to have two shelves. It's got two LED lights with a switch on the other side that I can turn off and on. And as I mentioned, that's the canyon that we built into the bench work. So there'll be, as I said, a plexiglass shelf here so I can put them aircraft below and above, and there'll be two plexiglass covers here that I can lift up and lock and put my scale models in there. So now it's on to the other slide out and where the river's going to go. This is a river. It drops down from the base of the bench work about 4 inches. And in the back there, we're going to have a waterfall, and there'll be a series of bridges that run across here. And the trains, we're going to have 3 to 4 separate tracks running 3 to 4 trains with appropriate transformers all over this. So that's the river, and this is going to be, this is the slide out, the second slide out I built. I actually built a test slide out, and it didn't come out very good, but I learned a lot from it. And now, again, all you have to do is part the curtains, grab the handle, pull it out, turn the transformers on, start running trains. So now let's take a look at the sequence photography that I did and how I built the bench work. And then when we're done, we'll talk about it for a minute on the backside. To build accurate quality bench work, you really need to use a compound miter saw. I have my Ryobi compound miter saw and the bench that comes with it, and it does a really good job. The benchwork framework is all screwed together with 3 and 4 inch deck screws, and I made a set of templates so that all of the attachment points for the 2x4s look really nice. I also pre-drilled all the screw holes, and I recessed them a little bit so that I wouldn't split the wood when inserting the screws, and all the screws would be flush with the surface of the 2x4s. All the benchwork legs were cut to 40 inches. And here, what I'm doing is positioning the first 2 legs and the cross member. The cross members had various lengths depending on where the finished frame was going to be located on the overall benchwork system. I built the vertical framing like an erector set. I pre-cut all of the pieces and then positioned them and clamped them to ensure that the vertical framing was what I wanted it to be. And here I'm testing all of the parts for the first vertical frame. And yes, you need a lot of clamps for this type of project. I elevated the framing and I used smaller pieces of 2x4s to block up the horizontal sections so that everything was true and at 90-degree angles to each other. Then, after everything was clamped together, I used the template to mark the locations of the holes and started drilling. The template allowed me to set 2 diagonal holes in each attachment point so that the framing would be much stronger. The second thing I did was add some 45-degree stiffeners so that the framing would not sway from left to right. Some of the framing had 2x4s attached to both sides of the vertical legs so that the long horizontal 2x4s, which are going to make up the lengths of the benchwork, could be attached to them securely. Here again, I'm using clamps in order to ensure all of the benchwork is true and at 90-degree angles, and that the pieces of wood won't move when I both pre-drill the holes and screw everything into place. The framing that had double horizontal beams had the 45-degree stiffeners slipped in between the beams on the lower framing. I also added a 12-inch length of 2x4 to the base of each vertical piece of framing so that the completed framing could stand up on its own. Each frame was double-checked after it was completed to ensure that it was both vertically and horizontally level. Also, take close note of the screw patterns. On the upper and lower areas, you can see how the screws are in opposite directions of each other and diagonally set. This helps ensure that the framing is strong. I built the entire benchwork by myself, and to accomplish this, I used a lot of wood clamps, which I had to set and reset as the horizontal lengths of 2x4s were carefully adjusted and positioned into place. In the next 3 photos, I'm going to demonstrate to you how I positioned all of the clamps in order to secure everything together. It's really important to have a lot of clamps and to take your time on doing this type of construction, especially when you're doing it by yourself. After all the horizontal sections were screwed into place, I added 4 45-degree stiffeners to the top framing. These 4 stiffeners made the framing much stronger and prevented any twisting. I also added interior framing to the top surface to support the plywood. I then added an additional piece at the top in order to attach the additional framing work to. The next 2 vertical framing sections were attached to the initial framing with 8-foot 2x4s. Note how I used a lot of wood clamps to get everything trued up correctly. From this angle, you can see much better how I positioned all of the clamps to hold everything together. As I was clamping the next 2 sections together, I noticed that the initial section had a little bit of left to right movement. So I added 2 stiffeners at these locations, and that solved the problem. These next 2 pictures are better close-ups of how I used the clamps and positioned them in order to ensure that everything was true and correct prior to screwing everything together. The second section is now complete. Note the double headers on both the top and the bottom on the left frame. This allows me to attach more 2x4s to it as I work my way to the left. I added this diagonal cross member to the back part of the framing, and it really helped stiffen up the overall framing so it wouldn't shift from left to right. I added 2x4s to the lower framing area to provide support for the plywood that'll provide shelving. The benchwork framing is now ready for the next 8-foot length. I used the same techniques as I had done previously for the first 8-foot length to attach everything together with wood clamps, true it up, and then pre-drill the holes and then start screwing everything into place. Notice the screw patterns are exact and precise thanks to the template that I made. The double headers on the top and bottom really made attaching additional lengths of 2x4s much easier. Notice how I'm using wood clamps properly positioned to hold everything together. I started adding the plywood shelving to the lower area in order to move my stash onto this shelving system to create more room. I'm using these 2 2x4s to mark the locations of where the river's going to be. I secured 2x4s to the underside of the horizontal framing and then cut the framing so that I could insert lengths of 2x4s to outline the river. After attaching the plywood base for the river, I realized that this length of 2x4 delineated by the arrow needed to be cut out, so I needed to add more framing to support everything. My solution was to add another length of 2x4 underneath the initial framing that I added, and this allowed me to cut out that nasty section of 2x4 so that I could have a better flowing river. I'm now adding the last 4 pre-constructed vertical benchwork sections, and I'm clamping everything together with long sections of 2x4s to help position the framing and true it all up. I clamped and screwed the 3 framing sections together on the left and then slowly worked my way towards the right. All the horizontal 2x4s have been screwed into place, and now it's time to stiffen it up and true it up. The canyon is going to be located in that open area between the frames that are close together. Here I'm using clamps and lengths of 2x4 to connect the 2 constructed benchwork sections together. The 2 benchwork sections are separated by about 24 inches, and this provides more than enough space for 2 people back to back to view trains running on both sides of the benchwork. Here I've added 2 stiffeners to prevent the benchwork from swaying from left to right. Here's how I use wood clamps to position the stiffeners prior to screwing them into the framing. Here I've added more stiffeners to prevent the framing from twisting or shifting, and I've added support framing for the plywood for the upper area as well as the shelving area. I've also started adding framing for the plywood for the canyon walls. There's a lot of 2x4s in this benchwork, but that's okay. I wanted the benchwork to be very strong so that I could walk on it if needed. With the plywood shelving system installed, now it's time to start working on the framing for the canyon. Here's how I did the side framing for the canyon walls. With the canyon wall framing complete, now it's time to start adding the plywood. I used the leftover plywood sections from the lower shelving to box in the canyon. And here I'm using clamps to position the plywood correctly so that I could mark it and cut it. The canyon is now boxed in and it looks pretty good, except I think it's a little too deep and a little too long. Next, I turn my attention to framing out the display case. Here I'm adding the roof section to it, and then I'll start working on the sides. Note the position of the framing for the ceiling. This prevented any sagging of the plywood. Here's how I use 2x4s to create a frame and a lip for the backside of the display case. All these 2x4s help prevent the backside of the display case plywood from bowing. I used the same framing technique on the plywood for the sides, and then I added the shelving system, and then I did all of the caulking so when it's painted it wouldn't show any cracks. In this photo and the next one, I show you how I set up the framing for the sliding draw system for the transformers as well as installing the tracks for the drawer. I built a test draw to check the slide system, and everything worked perfectly. So now it's time to work on the final draw system. I wasn't sure how much weight the draw could support when fully extended, but it supported this Z4000 transformer just fine. Here's the framing for the second slide out, which is going to be a little bit longer than the first one. These are the backstops for the drawer on the second slide out, and I didn't like the way they turned out, so I undid them and just put a length of 2x4, which worked a lot better. All the framing benchwork is now complete, and now it's time to add the plywood on the top surface. I carefully planned where all the plywood sheets would go, and then I measured those locations, and when I went to Home Depot, I had them cut all of the plywood, so all I had to do was lay it down, clamp it, and screw it on. Clamp the center section of the plywood length first, and then after it's pressed down, you can clamp the ends once it's all positioned. Once all the large sections of plywood sheeting were screwed down, I turned my attention to making the drawers for the slide-outs. I really liked the way they came out. I framed the drawers with select sections of 2x4s and then used really nice lengths of pine to plank the top. The framing for the slide-out drawers is very robust and it can support a lot of weight. The depth of the canyon was far too deep, so I extended the planking on the surface to give me more room to add more track. I also wanted to reduce the height of the canyon sides, so I added some framing and put down a new floor. The new canyon walls look much better and it'll be much easier to add rocks and scenery. With all of the large sections of plywood secured to the framing, all that's left is to piecemeal some of the open areas that I couldn't get Home Depot to cut for me. I really like the way this turned out. I also started painting the display case. I took these two videos prior to modifying the canyon. However, I've got all of the piecemealed sections screwed down and it really looks good. This area to the left by the back wall is going to be where the mountains are, and there'll be two different layers of mountains and 2 layers of trains aside from the base layer where 3 trains will run. And finally, the depth of the benchwork is about 26 feet. Hey everybody, I hope you enjoyed how I built the benchwork, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel, give us a thumbs up, and when to get the chance, visit us at www.mikeashley.com, and with that, have a great evening.